Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Uh, it's interesting. Zimbabwe is going to these elections, and there are some people who are absolutely hell bent on participating in these elections. Try as one might to explain to them, I think it's proving to be near impossible. It was the Russian dictator Stalin who was attributed to saying it is not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes. I think in Zimbabwe we have reached the point where people believe they have got to cast the vote. And that is the only way they're going to bring about change. To tell them that it is not enough to just cast the vote, as in this case here with the Russians, you should realize with casting of the vote, if the vote is not going to be weighed and made valid, it has got to be a meaningful vote. That is what we should be fighting for. Yes, of course, the first time when you cast the vote, you may not be aware of what's going on. But sooner or later, you should be learning that this is not right. Zimbabwe has been holding elections for the past 43 years. The watershed elections were in 2008. Up to that time, the country had held elections, and SADC, the AU, and most African countries had turned a blind eye to Zanu PF blatantly rigging these elections. But in 2008, the SADC region had managed to coerce Zanu PF into carrying out a number of significant changes, which effectively meant the regime switched off its vote rigging machinery. And so the March 2008 elections were the nearest Zimbabwe has ever got to holding free, fair, and credible elections. When the party realized that they were going to be defeated, they quickly turned on the vote rigging machinery and stopped the election commission declaring the results, and went on to spend the next 6 weeks recounting 5 million votes. Of course, they were watering down the opposition's victory, particularly in the presidential one. Morgan Tsvangirai had garnered, according to Mugabe's Freudian slip, 73% of the vote. They managed to whittle it down to 47%, just enough to force a runoff. And then during the runoff, the party used wanton violence to force people to vote for the Zanu PF candidate, Robert Mugabe. At the end of it, Zanu PF had the won the presidency, and the opposition had a narrow lead in the parliamentary. And Zanu PF, because it had the presidency, was going to be the governing party. SADC and the AU refused to accept those results. For the first time, Zanu PF realized that it could not always get its own way. They were forced to go into the government of national unity and to sign the 2008 Global Political Agreement, in which they agreed to implement democratic changes, which were designed to stop the blatant cheating and wanton violence of 2008. Those elections are very important in Zimbabwean history because they clearly showed that it is not enough to cast a vote if the regime has got so much power to blatantly change the results and then to use violence to coerce people to vote one way or the other. So that election should have sent a clear message to all Zimbabweans that we needed these reforms. SADC helped the country to go into this GNU, whose primary purpose was to implement those democratic reforms, to make sure that elections are meaningful. Alas, the opposition failed to implement even one meaningful reform in 5 years. And the people themselves were not paying attention, because they should have realized that without reforms, we are back to where we started in 2008. SADC itself did realize that. And in June 2013, they called a special SADC meeting at which they tried to convince the opposition, or the main opposition party then, MDC, the two MDC factions in the GNU, and Zanu PF, that the 2013 elections should be postponed until reforms are implemented. They even spoke to Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends that you guys don't go into these elections without reforms, because if you do, you'll lose them. The elections are done. They told them to their faces. But unfortunately, Morgan Tsvangirai and his friends did not listen. According to an interview that Morgan Tsvangirai gave after that year's election to Tawanda Majoni, he admitted that the MDC guys were so convinced that they were going to win the 2013 elections, even without any reforms implemented. But it comes back to what Joseph Stalin was saying here. It's not who votes that counts. It's who counts the votes. MDC rallies were well attended run up to the 2013 elections. In fact, the last rally that he held, I remember seeing pictures of it on the internet, was just outside the Sheraton in Harare, there was a sea of red. MDCT then, Sirgalia color was red. It left Morgan Tsvangirai and his colleagues convinced they were going to win the elections. But by noon that day, or voting day, it was already clear that Zanu PF was winning those elections. The rigging was so blatant. I remember talking to one of the MP candidates. I met him in London. He came back after the elections. He had been a parliamentary candidate in the rural areas. And he was shocked that on the day of voting, they had been told there were going to be X polling stations. And some of them, they had carried them on from the 2008 elections. In 2008, there'd been something like 10 polling stations in each parliamentary constituency. But in 2013, the number of polling stations has suddenly gone up. From 10 to about 45. %450% increase in the number of polling stations. And some of those polling stations, they were not announced until 2 days before voting day. So this guy was telling me some of those polling stations, he didn't know they were there. You know, you would meet people who would be saying to him, do you realize that at that school or that clinic, there's a polling station? And he would say, no, there's no polling station there. You'd go there and find out there are people voting. And you would run around to get an election agent to represent him at that polling station. Of course, it was futile. Zanu PF won with a landslide. Some of the other candidates talked about how Zanu PF was passing in voters from one polling station to another, costing multiple votes. That should have been a clear message that MDC then had made a mistake. They should have implemented the reforms. And indeed, some of them admitted, the likes of Tendai Biti admitted in 2015 that it was futile participating in these elections without reforms. The main problem people like Tendai Biti had was that they were talking to themselves. I'm sure they tried to convince their colleagues in the opposition of the sheer futility of participating in these elections without reforms. But by then, particularly those in the opposition who had been in the GNU, they had tested the sweetness of power. They knew that Zanu PF would be giving away a few seats to the opposition because that's the other things Zanu PF learned during the GNU as well, that it can continue rigging the elections, but as long as there's the opposition participating, it will get away with it. And so it was now a situation where trying to convince some of these people to stop participating in these elections was easier said than done. Tendai said this in 2015, but by 2018, when the next elections were due, he participated again. He has never come back to say why, but somebody else did. His colleague, David Coulthard, said the same thing. And in the case of David Coulthard, he went one step further and explained why MDC guys disregarded the argument that they should stop participating in these flawed elections. Greed. So for the opposition leaders participating in these elections, they knew they were flawed. They knew by participating they're giving Zanu PF legitimacy, but they continued to participate regardless out of greed. Of course, they could not tell their supporters that they're participating in these elections out of greed. They had to tell them something else. And they've been telling their supporters they are going to win the elections. In 2018, for instance, Chamisa told his supporters that MDC alliance has got stringent measures to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. I think the main problem we have with the ordinary people is that once the opposition decided they were going to participate, particularly the hardcore supporters of the opposition, the MDC, and now Triple C, those people do not think for themselves. They do as they are told. They follow blindly like sheep. So if the party said they were going to participate in the elections, to them, the subject was closed. They have to participate. So even when you've explained to them that the process is so flawed, as David Coulthard was saying here, the process was so flawed, so illegal, that the only logical step was to withdraw. He failed to convince his party leaders, his fellow party leaders. And once they decided they were going to participate, trying to tell this to the supporters, that this process is flawed, so flawed that you are not going to change the results, has proved to be a bridge too far. Mission impossible. These people are absolutely adamant that they must participate. Some of them even claim it is my democratic right to vote, to go and vote. And what about if the elections are rigged? They ignore that. Their right is to vote. It's tragic. Their right is actually to have a meaningful vote. So their right is to have reforms so that there is a meaningful vote. So their emphasis should be reforms so that we've got meaningful vote. Now they know the process is so flawed. Their vote is now totally meaningless. But such is their mentality that they have got it back to front. They think their number one duty is to vote. And the opposition have exploited that weakness because they've been telling these people one lie after another that they've got winning in rigged election strategies, and they've enumerated them one after another. And one after another, they've all shown to be just hot air. But has that changed some of these people's mind? Not a chance. I think the worsening economic situation has made the people even more desperate. This is not helping the country at all. Because come Wednesday, people will be running around like headless chickens. Many of them will find they cannot vote because the polling station they thought they were supposed to vote or their name should be is not there. The number of polling stations this year has been increased to over 12,000. So if you compare it to 2008, it's gone from about 10 polling stations per constituency to now over 60. 600%. So where there was one polling station, now there are 6 of them. And your name is not necessarily on any one of those 6. Or nearest to the one where you were familiar with. Because some names have been moved from one ward to another ward, some cases from one constituency to another constituency. In the rural areas, the voters will be frog marched to go and vote for Zanu PF. Yesterday, the police and those who will be on duty on voting day and therefore then deserved a postal vote were voting, and there were many reports of the police being forced to vote in the presence of their senior officer. Zanu is blatantly rigging these elections. And why some people are completely ignoring that reality and think that the only way they can change the situation is by stubbornly maintaining that they must go and vote. Beggars belief. It really comes back to this issue of, do they really appreciate the difference between free, fair, and credible elections and rigged elections? Or those qualifications do not count? It's the elections. The fact that their vote does not count has become immaterial now. They're going to vote or try to vote. I think it is a pity that we've got now a situation where both the ruling parties are not PF, who are rigging the elections, and the opposition led by Triple C, are now exploiting the people's desperation. Zanu PF would not win these elections if they were free, fair, and credible. Indeed, some people have argued that Mnangagwa will lose these elections to a donkey if the donkey was the only alternative and the elections were free, fair, and credible. That immediately underlines the people's desperation for change. They really don't care. They just want to get rid of Zanu PF. But you would think the opposition would win the elections, particularly if they were to focus on the main issue, making sure that the elections are free, fair, and credible. Not this opposition. This opposition has given up on reforms. They've given up in making sure that the elections are free, fair, and credible. All they are after is a share of the spoils of power. And so we find ourselves in this ridiculous situation where the opposition is keep on losing elections to Zanu PF. The opposition is actually participating to give Zanu PF legitimacy. And the people themselves are being dragged into these meaningless elections in the hope that this time there will be change, only to find they are giving Zanu PF legitimacy and helping to perpetuate the one-party state, the dictatorship, the failed state. It is unbelievable. But this is the reality in Zimbabwe. This is the situation we have in Zimbabwe. And it is a pity that even now, 45 years after independence, many of our people there have no idea what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. Worse still, some of the intellectuals themselves have no clue what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. Because some of them are the ones who are adamant that they must participate in these elections. Not to participate will be making a big mistake. Even when you've explained to them that by participating, you're only giving legitimacy to the system, to the process, to the flawed process. And as long as Zanu PF knows that you're going to participate, of course, the motive, there's no incentive for them to implement reforms. So I think by Wednesday this coming week, we could find ourselves in a situation. In fact, one doesn't have to wait for the results. The evidence is already there, is overwhelming on the ground that Zanu PF is rigging these elections. And by these people ignoring all that evidence and participating in this flawed process, they're only giving legitimacy to the process. And of course, many will complain that the process is flawed. In fact, some of them have already started complaining. but nobody will be listening to them. If SADC endorse the process, then we are in trouble, because it means another 5 years of this corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical regime. It's amazing that some people are finding what should really be obvious is, I don't know. You would think differentiating between free, fair, and credible elections and rigged elections. By now, 43 years after independence, after 43 years of rigged elections, that point, people would understand. No, these are flawed elections. These are rigged elections. We can't keep on participating in rigged elections. But clearly, people still haven't mastered that subtle difference. But until they do, this carry on will continue. If people are just content with a vote, whether or not it's a meaningful vote, Zanu PF will never do anything to change it. So this is the tough reality. And it is a pity we are going round and round in circles here. Before I close, I'll just add a comment by one of the viewers. Grace is saying, I believe SADC will support, I think she means outcome, in Zanu PF's favor. Well, I believe so too. SADC has supported Zanu PF rigged elections since 2013 and then 2018. More out of what else could they have done, to be fair to them. In 2013, they are the ones who told Morgan Tsvangirai and company, do not participate in these elections. If you do, you lose, because without reforms, Zanu PF will rig these elections. And MDC ignored them. What else could SADC have done? So in this particular case, I think they will do the same thing again. More so now, in fact, given that South Africa, the ANC government in South Africa has already declared its position that it was not going to allow regime change in Zimbabwe, because the West have imposed sanctions on Zanu PF. And because of that, they were not going to allow regime change. And the sanctions have not been lifted. And so ANC would want to support Zanu PF. And in this particular case, supporting Zanu PF, stopping regime change means endorsing the result. So the chances are SADC will. But I think we, the ordinary people, and many of the intellectuals too out there, have made it very easy for SADC to make that decision. Because by agreeing to participate in these flawed elections, I think we've made it easy for SADC to say, well, if Zimbabweans themselves are happy with the process, flawed as it is, who are we to stop them? The only way we would have put pressure on SADC not to endorse these elections is if many Zimbabweans out there had condemned the process and had condemned the opposition for selling out and participating in flawed elections out of greed. Yes, there have been some people who've made those complaints. But would I say that it was an overwhelming voice, loud and clear, of condemnation of the process? The answer is no. Many people are saying, well, let's wait and see. Unfortunately, that is no good to the country at all. If you don't say anything to protest the process, it doesn't matter. It's assumed that you approve of it. It's a common known maxim in law, silence is consent. And in this particular case, you never protested the process. So people assumed you participated willingly. How anyone could say the process is anything other than flawed when you do not even have a verified voters roll? It turns out that the voters roll that ZEC gave to the candidates in the late last month, in July, turned out it wasn't the correct voters roll. They should have given them a voters roll that gives the details of the individual and the polling station. And that wasn't the voters roll, and the voters roll that was going to be used in these elections. That is not the voters roll that was distributed. And it's interesting to note that all the candidates participating accepted this useless voters roll, have never complained. That issue actually was raised by Professor Jonathan Moyo. He's the one who noted that that voters roll that was given was a useless one. So the Zanu PF is rigging these elections. That's the bottom line. And the fact that most of our people are participating in these elections out of ignorance of not knowing the difference between free, fair, and credible elections and rigged elections is also unforgivable. 43 years after independence, and you still do not know the subtle difference between free and fair elections and rigged elections. God help us. But that is the reality. And as for the opposition themselves, they are participating in these flawed elections out of greed. Pure and simple. And they've known it all along since 2013. They only give all these stories about having, strategies of winning rigged elections just to hide their greed. That's all. So we will have to come back to explaining to people that there is actually a very big difference between free, fair, and credible elections and rigged elections. Your democratic right is the right to a meaningful vote. That means free, fair, and credible elections. If the process is rigged, you are not exercising your right anymore. You have been denied that right. You're being given a ballot paper which you would put your eggs in good faith that it will count, when in reality that ballot will not count at all. And we have learned enough in the last 43 years to know, or we should have learned enough in 43 years to know what is the difference between a meaningful vote and a meaningless vote, free, fair, and credible elections, and rigged elections. I think it is disappointing that some people out there still do not understand that there is a world of difference between the two. But be that as it is, the nation will pay for it. Firmly believe that Zanu PF will rig and win these elections and extend their stay in power by another 5 years. Just the prospects of Zanu PF in power for another 5 years is daunting. The country is a failed state already. And it is tragic that we are going to sink deeper and deeper into this into this hell on earth hole that we made for ourselves. It is tragic. But that is the price we pay for failing to understand something as obvious as what is free, fair, and credible elections. In this day and age, there is really no reason why somebody should fail to understand that. I'll just post one last comment from Grace there. Milking Zimbabwe, and let us Zimbabweans suffer. Well, this is the reality. To all the listeners out there, thank you very much. And it is, yes, personally, I'm disappointed that Zimbabweans have taken this long to understand this simple message, and they still don't understand it. You know, it cannot be, I mean, it's not rocket science, let's be honest about it. You know, free, fair, and credible elections and rigged elections, that's not rocket science. I refuse to accept that. There's absolutely no excuse why people are failing to understand the difference. And to keep on participating to give Zanu PF legitimacy and perpetuate your own suffering, well, that's your own fault. And you pay dearly for it. And the nation is going to pay dearly for it. Because if Zanu PF is confirmed next Wednesday as the winner, another 5 years of this failed state. Oh God, I don't know, it's tragic. That's all I can say. Really tragic. It's unforgivable. And we could have stopped it if we only had used some common sense here. That's my last word. And thank you and good night.